The training ground stretched across the frost-bitten plains of Vex Prime, where the Galactic Combat Academy molded the fiercest predators in known space into disciplined soldiers. Ilara stood in the center of the circular arena, her breath forming small clouds in the thin atmosphere. Around her, 12 Vexian cubs, each the size of an earth tiger, with obsidian scales and eyes that glowed like molten amber, prowled in practice formation. The instructors watched from their elevated platform, their chitinous frames gleaming under the pale sun. Commander Zekthor, a mantis-like being whose species had dominated warfare for 3 millennia, clicked his mandibles in what passed for a smile among his kind. "Begin the trial," he announced, his voice amplified across the arena. "The human has requested inclusion in our elite program. Let us see if her species' reputation for stubbornness translates to survival." The other instructors chittered with amusement. Humans were notorious across the galaxy, not for their strength, which was mediocre, nor their speed, which was laughable compared to most species. They were known for their audacity, their refusal to acknowledge their own limitations, and their bizarre tendency to befriend creatures that should, by all logic, consume them. Ilara had been the first human to petition for entry into the Academy in its 4,000-year history. The instructors had accepted her application purely for entertainment value. "Attack Protocol 7, Zekthor commanded the cubs. "Non-lethal force. We want to see how long she lasts." The Vexian cubs were bred for war, genetically enhanced from birth to be faster, stronger, and more vicious than their already formidable ancestors. At 6 months old, they could tear through reinforced steel. These cubs were approaching their first year. Drax, the largest of the group, stood at the front. His scales were darker than his siblings, and a ridge of spines ran along his spine, markings of a future pack leader. He had been raised since hatching to obey commands without question, to see every exercise as preparation for glorious combat. But something was wrong. For the past 6 weeks, since Ilara had arrived at the academy, she had been assigned to the Cubs' care detail as part of her support duties. While other trainees complained about the menial work, Ilara had embraced it. She cleaned their quarters, prepared their meals, and sat with them during their rest periods. She had done something no Vexian handler had ever done. She spoke to them. Not commands, but actual conversation. She asked them questions, told them stories about Earth, about creatures called dogs and cats and horses. She described how humans had once been prey animals themselves, living in fear of larger predators, and how they had survived not through strength, but through community. And she had touched them. Vexian cubs were never touched except for medical procedures or combat training. Physical affection was considered weakness, a liability that would compromise their effectiveness. But Ilara scratched behind their auditory ridges, rubbed the spot between their shoulders that they couldn't reach themselves, and when Drax had injured his paw during a training exercise, she had stayed with him through the night, her hand resting on his flank, whispering that he was brave, that he was strong, that he would heal. Now, as the command to attack echoed across the arena, Drax felt something he had never experienced before: conflict. The other cubs tensed, ready to spring. They had trained for this scenario 100 times. The target was in the center. They would circle, coordinate, strike in waves. It was simple, but this was not just any target. This was their human. Drax took a step forward, and the cubs followed his lead. The instructors leaned forward with interest. Perhaps the human would show some of that legendary creativity her species was known for. Perhaps she would fight or flee or beg. Instead, Ilara stood perfectly still. She looked directly at Drax, and her face did something the instructors couldn't quite interpret. Her lips curved upward, her eyes softened. She was smiling. "It's okay, Drax," she said quietly, her voice somehow carrying across the arena despite not being amplified. "I know you have to do this. I won't hold it against you." Something inside Drax's chest, something that had been coiled tight since the moment of his hatching, suddenly loosened. The confusion crystallized into clarity. He took another step toward Ilara, but instead of lowering into an attack stance, he positioned himself directly in front of her. His tail swept wide, creating a barrier. Behind him, he could feel Ilara's slight form, could hear her heartbeat, faster than normal but not panicked, trusting. The other cubs hesitated. Pack hierarchy demanded they follow their leader. But the instructors had given a direct command. Then Crix, the smallest of the group, The one Ilara had nicknamed Brave Little Heart, because he always tried hardest despite his size, moved to Drax's side. Then Scylla, then Nox. Within seconds, all 12 cubs had formed a defensive circle around Ilara, facing outward, their backs to her, scales raised and spines extended in a threat display. But they weren't threatening Ilara. They were threatening anyone who might harm her. The arena fell silent, except for the wind. The instructors stared, their compound eyes reflecting something that might have been shock. Commander Zekthor rose from his seat. Unacceptable. Cubs, you are in violation of direct orders. Stand down and execute your mission, Drax growled, a deep resonant sound that carried a warning. The other cubs joined in, a chorus of defiance that had never been heard in the Academy's long history. Ilara, surrounded by her protective barrier of scales and loyalty, felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She reached out and placed her hand on Drax's shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "This is impossible," muttered Instructor Velshaw, a scarab-like being. "They're conditioned from birth. Their programming is absolute." "Perhaps," said another instructor, the eldest of them. "That is precisely the problem. We programmed them for obedience, for violence, for war, but we never taught them why to fight." She paused, her ancient eyes fixed on the scene below. "The human did in 6 weeks what we couldn't do in 4,000 years. She gave them something worth protecting." Commander Zekthor's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of agitation. But slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself back into his seat. "Training suspended," he announced. All parties returned to quarters. As Ilara walked out of the arena, the cubs maintained their protective formation around her, Drax at her side. The instructors watched in silence, several of them already composing reports that would change Academy doctrine forever. Humans, they would write, possess a capability we had not anticipated. They could weaponize love, and in a galaxy built on domination, that made them the most dangerous species of all.